Benton Mackay inspired the Appalachian Trail, writing about his vision in 1921. He was the idea man. But Myron Avery built it, taking the lead from Mackay in 1935 when this photograph was taken. Avery was a Maine lawyer. In 1927, he moved to Washington, D.C. to join the federal government as an admiralty lawyer and formed an organization, the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club, to select, mark, and build the AT in the Mid-Atlantic. At the time, there was no continuous trail south of New York. The Mid-Atlantic region was next in line geographically. Avery not only led the project in the Mid-Atlantic, he took over the entire trail project. See Avery on the far left on top of Katahdin with PATC members. In 1931, he succeeded Arthur Perkins as head of the Appalachian Trail Conference, and for the next 21 years he dominated the AT. Possessed of incredible energy and little patience for delay, he pushed, he cajoled, he demanded of volunteers more than they thought they could give. Led by Avery, by 1937, the entire trail had been selected and marked and was pronounced finished. Of course, there were long road walks, and much of it was on private property with only handshake agreements. The Appalachian Trail that we know today arose from the one that Avery created. In the early 1930s, we don't actually know the precise dates, Avery and his supervisor of trails, Frank Shirer, made an instructional video. That's Avery in the black boxer shirt with his measuring wheel lying near him. They hoped that other trail clubs would replicate what PATC was doing. The next 15 minutes shows Avery and Shirer leading a trail crew in some of the earliest AT construction south of New York. We don't know the location, but some of the scenes appear to have been shot in the area that was to become Shenandoah National Park. The first step was to mark the route. They didn't have flagging tape. Instead, they used balls of twine. That's Shirer with the twine. Avery is just ahead of Shirer, directing the activity. Next, they would go through with loppers and axes. They rarely used saws in the early days. Shirer's classic trademark was a pair of loppers over his shoulder. That's Shirer on the left repairing his loppers. Next, they would go through with grass whips. They would clear the trail until it was fairly level and there was no vegetation. Here they are demonstrating the technique of using the grass whip. We still use these on the trails today. Now that's a tool that we don't see anymore. Avery was an enthusiastic chopper. The trail was rocky in those days, just like it is today. Chopping with an axe is a lot more work than sawing. Just like today, they had to remove blowdowns. This was a small blowdown, but I've seen Avery tackle blowdowns that were 2 feet thick. Note the old gentleman in the 3-piece suit. He doesn't even take off his hat to remove this blowdown. They always picked axes rather than saws. Was that a macho thing? Now the girls, they used saws, and they got the job done quicker than the men did, and with a lot less effort. They seem to have been smarter than the men. Avery had a philosophy of trail building. The AT should be hikeable by the average tramper, he said, and he insisted that ATC adopt a protocol for identifying and marking trails so that they could be readily found. Signage was a big thing with Avery. Here's an AT logo. In the 1930s, it looked about like it does today. There were a lot of open areas in those days, a lot more than there are today because the AT went through fields and farmers' areas. So they had to find out how to do that, and generally they would build a rock cairn to indicate the path of the trail. They were very particular about these cairns, and they built it and rebuilt it until they had it right. Because of all the farms in those days, stiles were more common then than they are now. Since the federal government has purchased virtually the entire trail corridor, you rarely see stiles now. Blazing apparently originated in New England. It was Avery who decided on the white blaze, and Egbert Walker, who later became PATC's mapmaker, painted the first white blaze just north of Virginia Route 7 at Snicker's Gap. No, you can't find it anymore. He painted it on a large chestnut tree, and all the chestnuts were subsequently killed by the blight. The measuring wheel became Avery's trademark. This is not Avery, but they're demonstrating the use of the measuring wheel. Avery was never seen without a measuring wheel, even on recreational hikes. He was the first person ever to walk the entire AT, and you can bet that he had the wheel with him every step of the way. Here you can see Avery marking private property to make sure that hikers knew that they were not on public land and should respect the private property. Water sources were just as important then than they are now. Avery wanted a sustainable trail. Viewpoints were very important to the hiking experience, one of the reasons that people walked trails in the first place. This viewpoint is probably the Susquehanna River at Duncannon. In those days, this was the northern terminus of PATC's section. Today, it is maintained by Mountain Club of Maryland. Guidebooks and maps were critical to making the trail accessible. Maps have always been a very big deal with PATC. Side trails were important as access points to the AT as they are now, and they were blazed blue from the very earliest days. Final improvement envisioned by Avery were places to stay to get out of the rain. New England trails already had shelters for hikers, generally three-sided structures variously termed lean-tos, shelters, or huts. Avery was determined to expand this system south, and his first entry was a locked cabin, which they called a shelter in those days. The first cabin was Sexton Cabin, donated by Dr. Roy Sexton, and construction was begun in May of 1930. Thus, as we see Dr. Roy Sexton pounding in the first stake, we can date this clip to May of 1930. PATC contracted with local residents to build this magnificent stone cabin. Thereafter, Avery began planning a system of lean-tos, which we call shelters today, along the entire AT. Within a few years, PATC had over 30 lean-tos on its trail section, most of them built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Sadly, the Sexton Cabin was removed in the late 30s because it was too close to a Shenandoah National Park picnic ground. It was rebuilt of wood in Ramsey's Draft, part of George Washington National Forest, in 1938.